Welcome to the 2021 Online Economic History Workshop panel entitled Who You Know, Personal Connections and Reconciliation. I am Ahmed Rahman of Lehigh University. Today, there will be two presenters. Jean Lacroix from Université Paris-Saclay will discuss the impact of how the similarities between defendants and the tribunal judging them for collaborating with the Vichy and Nazi regimes in France affected the odds of them being purged. And Michael Giorcelli from the University of California, Los Angeles, on how the withdrawal of technical support from the Soviet Union to Chinese factories after the collapse of the Sino-Soviet alliance affected individual plant production. After both panelists speak, Aaron Honsowetz from Bethany College is going to reflect on both presentations. Finally, we will finish the panel with the panelists responding to questions from Aaron and you, the audience. You can submit questions for consideration by posting them to Twitter with the hashtag OEHW2021 or by submitting them on YouTube. I recommend submitting questions as soon as you think of them, so I have time to read through them before the start of questions and answers. Remember, all the work you are seeing are works in progress. Your questions and feedback can help the presenters improve their research. We now start the Who You Know, Personal Connections and Reconciliation panel with Jean Lacroix's presentation on the origins of elite persistence. Jean.
All right, thank you. Sorry, I was just jungling around. So thank you for the invitation. I'm pretty glad to present this paper co-authored with Pierre-Guillaume, Méon, and Toke on the origins of elite persistence. So basically the starting point of the study is just that in many countries, and I think in yours, you can find examples of elites that will somehow stay in power despite political transitions and even after political transitions. And we know that this persistence is somehow detrimental for growth, could lead to corruption or bad institutional outcome. And when you think of this persistence over political transitions, you may think of the paper by Ashimoglu and Robinson explaining this persistence with de facto power. So basically, elites will invest in the de facto power, and by investing in that de facto power, they could persist and stay in power. So we don't really know what this de facto power actually is. So there's some hypothesis. It could be wealth and weapons, the suppression of competition, or just better political skills. But so far, we don't really have a theory of what we call democratic purges. So these purges happening after democratic transitions that will determine which elites will be able to take part in a new regime or not. And it's been the case not only in France after 1945, but also in Poland, post-Pinochet Chile, or South Africa. And we don't have really clear empirical evidence to answer, do elites actually survive political transitions? And is this distortion, this persistence distorted, sorry? So are some elites more likely to survive political transitions than others? And how do they do so if it's the case? And so our paper will try to answer these two questions, and so it relates to research on political selection, so how the selection of politicians could matter, elite persistence within political regimes, and some mechanisms we know of, like dynastic persistence, incumbency, or the role of connections. And this paper focuses more on what determines the persistence after political transitions, and we know of one paper that, showing that some mayors have an incumbency advantage in post-Pinochet Chile. Here we'll look at the pool of potential candidates in elections. And we'll also talk about judicial bias, political purges, and connections in politics. So we'll start just by telling you a bit of the context in 1945 France. Basically, if you can read French, you understand that it was tense. So some people really wanted the collaborators to die. And so the way to deal with these other collaborators was not obvious. And so France put up a transition process. So just a timeline for you to remember some historical facts. So from 1940 to August 1945, the Vichy regime was in place. And so France was collaborating with Nazi Germany. From August 1944, transitional power took place and declared all acts taken by the Vichy regime void. And then you start having elections already in 1945. But right before these elections, France created the Jury d'honneur. And so this Jury d'honneur was aimed at purging politicians because before they could run for elections. And finally, at the end of 1946, the Constitution of the Fourth Republic ended this transition period. So what is interesting in the political purges of France? So first, because you're in France, it's well documented. And the process started in April 1945. And so this special court was just set to declare if a politician could run for election or not. So it was just to declare a politician eligible or ineligible. In terms of defendants, so all MPs having voted full powers to Marshal Pétain or have been involved in Vichy institutions faced this purging process. The clearance rule was clear, so you could be acquitted if you show evidence of participation in resistance before 1943. And a special setting we use in our studies, the procedure, the purging process adopted. So basically, it was a two-step procedure. In the first step, politicians were judged in front of local courts. These local courts are called Comité départemental de libération. And these local courts just emit a first decision on whether or not we should purge these politicians. In the second step, the Jury d'honneur, the national court, gathers extra proof and rule about the case as well, and it could overrule the first judgment. So we have two judgments per defendant. When we mean extra proofs, it could be administrative reports or what we call letters of support. So some supporters of the defendant actually writing to the jury to tell them to acquit the defendant. So when looking or when investigating the Jury d'honneur, it's super interesting to look at who was in charge back then. So basically, it was René Cassin, André Pestelvin, and Maxime Bloch-Mascar. The three of them represented different parts of the resistance. But they also share in common, have these characteristics in common, that they all are somehow related to law faculties in Paris. And René Cassin, the president of the jury, is even defined in the dictionary of the resistance as the jurist of Free France. And why is it so interesting? Is because it somehow reflects the weight law graduates or lawyers had in French politics in the interwar period. So they were overrepresented in the parliament, but if you're looking at important positions like prime ministers, 13 French prime ministers out of 19 were actually law graduates. So it's not they're just in parliament, they also occupy very important positions. During the purges, as I've just told you, all members of the jury are somehow related to Parisian law universities. And we know that after World War II, law graduates are still overrepresented in the parliament. And we also know that it's a cohesive milieu. They have the bar association, speech contest, and so on. So they likely know each other. So somehow we have a process, we see some persistence of a group, and we know that within the court deciding on the outcome of the purging process in France, we have law graduates. So we might have a story about connections there. And so when we returned to archives, we looked at proofs of the role of connection in the process. So the first level of proof is what defendants actually were saying. And maybe my favorite bit in the archives is one defendant telling General de Gaulle, okay, this process is not about justice, but it's about connections. So that's the first level of proof. The second level of proof is actually observing connections at play in the archives of the Jury d'honneur. And so we see some defendants telling the president of the jury, okay, people told me to use my connections. We see some of them actually reaching the brother of the president out to support their case. And we also see the interventions of, for example, the Home Affairs Ministry telling the jury, okay, we should have a closer look at this case. So what we'll do, we'll use data on individual characteristics of all MPs. So we have religion, political mandates, memberships to secret association, and so on and so forth. And we'll use data we have on decisions by the two levels of courts. So just to give you an idea of what our data look like. So basically, in quite a lot of cases, the jury, so the national court and the local courts, agreed on not acquitting the defendant. In some of them, they agreed that the defendant could be acquitted. And what we'll use is these cases here, the cases in which they disagreed. And to do so, you might think of what are the determinants of a court decision. So the first determinant would be court characteristics. So some courts will be more lenient than others, and so will be more likely to acquit a defendant. The second one, the second determinant is our defendant characteristics. So basically, some defendants will share characteristics that will prove that they will more likely be guilty, or in that case, to have been collaborating with the Vichy regime. A third component would be specific to a court and a defendant group. So it will only apply to a group sharing one characteristics in front of one court. And if you think of it, once you've controlled for court characteristics, defendant characteristics, you can somehow capture this third element. So the specific advantage one specific group has before one specific court. And we label this component as the advantage of a group during the purging process. And that's what we'll assess. And shortly, we'll just do so with a simple diff and diff estimate. So we control for court characteristics, for defendant characteristics, we even throw some defendant fixed effect there. And then we estimate this variation in clear acquittal rates within the group of a group of defendants and within courts. So that's our results in a nutshell. So when we look at law graduates and we compare the acquittal rates of law graduates in front of local courts, so here CDLs, actually it's not significantly statistically different from the acquittal rates of other defendants. But when you turn to proceedings of the jury, you see that law graduates are actually more likely to be acquitted by the jury. And so our estimator is actually this difference here plus this difference here. So we have the difference between the two groups, and how this difference between the two groups will vary between courts. So if you want to have a table with regression, simply that's exactly the same thing, but adding some more covariates to be sure that you are actually capturing the effect of being a law graduate in front of the jury. And what we see is that the acquittal rates of law graduates is 10 percentage points higher in front of the jury in comparison to others in front of the other courts. It doesn't depend on other characteristics and it doesn't depend on information on resistance activity. So what we do here is that we control for a lot of different characteristics that are also interacted with the jury dummy variable. And the main characteristics is the information we have in the dossier about participation in resistance, since it's the rule they apply to acquit people. We also see how our effects will depend on whether a defendant planned to run for election or not. And actually the effect only appeared in cases where the defendant was planning to run for election. So it might be at least one explanation of some persistence of this group after World War II. The results are robust to a lot of things, but we'll go directly to mechanisms. So to investigate a bit the mechanisms explaining this advantage of law graduates in front of the jury, we'll go to the dossier, to the archives in front of the jury. And we'll test, okay, are these dossiers of law graduates different from others? And are these differences actually explaining why the acquittal rates of law graduates is actually higher than the acquittal rates of others? So we'll use an original data set of approximately 18,000 documents in individual dossier in front of the jury. So we have the investigation of the jury, administrative reports, and also the letters of support that the jury has used as evidence. So we will test several hypotheses. The first hypothesis is just to say, okay, maybe law graduates are better at providing evidence. They write longer statement of defense and so on and so forth. So what we do is we compare dossier in front of a lot of metrics, and we don't see that the dossier of law graduates are actually bigger or contain more documents or more letters of support than any other document. The second point is that, okay, law graduates, because they are trained in law, might be better at presenting evidence. And maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A, but we have some tests, and apparently that's not the case. So then we return to connections. So first we turn to direct connections, so the connections between one defendant and the jury. And we see that interaction between defendant and the jury are actually not explaining the effect. Even if we see that actually law graduates might be better connected to the jury at the first place. But our explanation actually is more about indirect connections. So the content of these letters of support. And what we do is actually we see on average how often a supporter of a defendant was writing documents to the jury beyond his role as supporter. And what we see is that actually law graduates have better connected defendants. And in the second stage, we see that this put it simple, that this higher likelihood of having better support actually explains part of the higher acquittal rate of law graduates. We see a specific effect of a network from Paris that is only working for law graduates, and we see the importance of very well connected supporters, both for law graduates and for other defendants. And so, because I'm running out of time, just to conclude, we have a case in which we see that two levels of court might rule cases differently, and we use these differences in rulings to see that indirect connections might matter, and then might explain elite persistence. And I thank you for your attention and look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Jean. We continue the panel with Michela Giorcelli's presentation on technological transfer and early industrial development. Michela.
Hi, everyone. I would like to thank you, the organizer, for giving me the opportunity of presenting this joint work with Boli, whose motivation is that the international transfer of knowledge and technology are considered key elements of economic development. And they've been widely used to push industrialization in developing countries, both through the diffusion of state-of-the-art capital good and to the dissemination of specific know-how in order to create industry establishment and development later on. Despite their importance, there is little causal effect on little causal evidence on the effects on early industrial development, mostly because lack of long-term data and natural variation in the delivery of such policies, and also because knowledge and technology transfer often occur simultaneously, making it hard to disentangle between their separate effects. To answer this question, we use evidence from a unique historical episode, which is the Sino-Soviet alliance between 1950 and 1960, that, among other interventions, sponsored the so-called 156 projects for the construction of technologically advanced, large-scale, capital-intensive industrial facilities. These facilities could be of two types: the basic projects, whose goal was to duplicate whole Soviet plants and transfer state-of-the-art machinery and equipment, and advanced projects that, on top of the basic component, also offer training of Chinese engineers and technicians, as well as technical assistance. And through this project, China received the best technology available in Soviet Union, that in some specific industries like steel and iron was the best in the world. In terms of data, we collected data on all the approved projects between 1950 and 1957 that we matched with plant-level data in the steel industry and firm-level data in 1985 and between 1998 and 2013 for all the industries. And in terms of identification, we exploit some unexpected delays that arose after the project starts, mostly related to Soviet issues rather than project characteristics. So when in 1960, the Sino-Soviet split implied the sudden cancellation of technology transfer, projects that experienced fewer delays had already received and retained the planned transfer, where projects that experienced more delays were completed by China only using domestic technologies. And I will show later that these two types of projects were very similar in their observable characteristics and the characteristics of the province and the industries in which they were located. We find three key results. So first up, there were large and persistent effects of advanced transfer that determine an increase in input quality and quantity. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the effect, productivity increased by 52% in a 40-year time horizon, while the effect of the basic transfer receiving just machinery were positive but short-lived, and they start declining as the life cycle of the machine ended. Moreover, the advanced treated plants were able to domestically develop new technology that were used to replace the Soviet capital with, when it started becoming obsolete with home-produced modern machinery. And when China opened up to international trade, these firms were relying less on foreign imported capital and more on exports. And finally, as the goal of the program was to create local industrial development, we also study whether it creates any spillovers effect. And what we find is that there was an increase in productivity for firms that relate close to the advanced treated plants that also adopted technology from them. And since the late 1990s, we also observe a reallocation from state-owned to private-owned firms. In the interest of time, let me skip the contribution to the literature. And in the rest of the talk, I will go through the context and empirical strategy. I will describe our main results and the spillovers effect, and then some conclusive remarks. So to get started with the context and empirical strategy, the implementation of the Soviet technology transfer faced many issues on the ground, as machinery, equipment, and design very often arrived late or start the operation later than planned. This was due to three main reasons: constraint on the Soviet production capacity. Soviet Union didn't have any equipment of machinery in reserve, and so they had to produce for Chinese demand. And if there were some issues in Soviet plants, the shipment to China were blocked, and the capital goods for China were used for domestic production. The second reason was that there were too few Soviet experts able to visit Chinese plants, and also too few translators. And so sometimes these experts had to deal with some internal problems before being able to go to China, or to wait translators that can go with them in visit Chinese plants. And also some miscommunication between Soviet and Chinese experts that determined, for instance, some design didn't fit the plant because there was not a clear understanding of the characteristics of the Chinese needs on that side. In 1960, the Sino-Soviet split suddenly ended, and so did the technology transfer. Therefore, projects that experienced fewer delays had already received and maintained the planned transfer, where projects with more delays were completed by China only, without any Soviet capital good or assistance, following the Soviet plans but employing domestic technology. This difference between projects leads our empirical specification that consists of a comparison between projects that eventually receive the planned transfer, that we will call basic or advanced treated projects, and projects that were eventually completed by China that were called basic or advanced comparison projects based on the type of transfer that they were supposed to receive. In our specification, we also control for the baseline project characteristics, as well as for sector, province, and time fixed event. The identification assumption is that the delays that projects face were orthogonal to their characteristics or their potential to be successful. And indeed, we show that their characteristics were very balanced, both for the basic transfer and for the advanced transfer. We look at where the projects were supposed to start, the measure of their complexity, so how big the investment was, what was the expected length, what was the actual number of workers that these projects employed, as well as the capacity. And we also look at the distance from treated ports, rail and railways, to exclude that projects that were more connected or more easy to access may have experienced fewer delays. We also test that the industry and project characteristics do not predict the probability of receiving the treatment. This test is helpful to understand whether there were some industries that were considered more important for economic development, or provinces that may have developed more no matter the technology transfer. But again, it doesn't seem to be the case. And finally, we think about whether there could have been a reallocation from treated to comparison projects that can invalidate our identification strategy. But before the split, the machinery and the experts were very project specific, so China could not reallocate them across the country. And after the split, the data on firm capital actually showed that plans retained the capital received by the Soviet Union, and also the fact that migration was highly restricted allows us to exclude large inflows of workers from treated to comparison projects. So in terms of the effect of technology transfer, we will start by looking at the effect on plants in the steel industry, for which we observe early data between 1949 and 2000. So first of all, a comparison between advanced treated and comparison plants shows that the output started increasing immediately after plant opening, and it continued to rise, reaching a 55% overall gain over a 40-year period. If we look at the basic treated and comparison projects, we can see that the effect took longer to materialize, probably because these plants didn't have know-how to operate the new machinery. Then the effect started rising up to 15 years after the program, they flattened down, and then they start decreasing after 25 years, which is the supposed length of the life cycle of a Soviet machine, and then stop being significant. We find similar effect on productivity, persistent effects of the advanced transfer, and short-lived effect on the basic transfer. We also run a bunch of robustness checks and additional results that I have to skip in the interest of time, but maybe we can keep back on those during the Q&A. And the second set of results involves the development of new technologies, in the sense that advanced treated plants were the only one able to develop the basic oxygen converters and the continuous casting furnaces that were considered state-of-the-art in the steel production in the late 60s and the 70s, when China was a closed economy and had very limited trade interaction with other countries. As a result, these plants disproportionately adopted the basic oxygen converters and the continuous casting furnaces. And later on, when China started opening up to international trade at the beginning of the 80s, the advanced treated plants were relying less on foreign imported capital, but at the same time, they were exporting more, and they were also producing more steel that was above the international standards, which we think this is a very useful information because it shows that Chinese steel was perceived not only good within the country, but also in the international market. We also look at a spillovers effect. Specifically, we focus on the horizontal and vertical spillovers, which shows that most of the spillovers effect were occurring close to treated, advanced treated plants. Plants that were close to advanced treated plants and were operating in the same industry increased the production of steel, increased their probability, technological adoption in the 60s and the 70s, and we're also exporting more and produce higher quality of steel after 1985 when China gradually opened up to trade. If we focus on the vertical spillovers, what we find is that firms that locate close to both basic and advanced treated plants were producing more. And we explain this result by thinking that these plants were producing more, and so likely demanding more inputs and outsourcing more output to nearby firms, but only firms that were close to the advanced plants had an increase in productivity, in technology adoption, and we're also exporting more and producing higher quality steel when China opened up to trade. In the last part of the paper, we examined the interaction between the institutional changes that China faced in the late 90s and the legacy of the technology transfer. Specifically, starting in the late 90s, China allowed for waves of privatization, and so firms that were originally state-owned became private-owned. So for treated and comparison plants remain state-owned until 2013, so they are not the focus of our analysis, but firms close to them that became private are the plants that we are considering in this analysis. And what we show here is that plants that became private between 1998 and 2013, and we were close to advanced plants, had a gain in terms of value added, productivity, and exports, which with an additional positive effect for new private firms that locate in this area between 1998 and 2013. So we try to disentangle what are the mechanisms that can explain these results. And specifically, what we find is that in the counties where the advanced treated plants were located, there is a higher fraction of firms that became privately owned, and these likely forced them to be more productive in order to beat the increased competition. And if we look at the education, again, in the counties where advanced treated plants were located, we find that there was a higher level of education in terms of college, graduate, and high-skilled workers. And we think that these results can also explain why private firms were doing better in these counties as when they were private, and so they start competing also in the input labor market with the registration system, the UKU system, still in place, so limited mobility. They were able to rely with on a better level of human capital that likely improved their performance. I'm out of time, so let me just wrap up. In this paper, we studied the long-run effect on technology transfer, finding that it had persistent effect if it was associated with training for human capital, and also it was related to domestic technology development and substantial spillovers effect. In terms of policy implication, technology transfer programs are still widely used today to promote the industrialization. And so I think that in this paper, what we show is that the effects of a technology transfer from foreign countries cannot be achieved by trying to imitate them with domestic technology, but also that foreign on-the-job training and know-how diffusion is very important for having long-lasting effects of these policies, and also for generate substantial spillovers effect. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop there, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Gaela. Now, Aaron Honsowetz will provide discussions for both works. Aaron.
Thank you. And thank you for the papers. They were a joy to read. And I'm going to first look at the origins of leak persistence. And when I do that, I want to think about the theory, then the identification, and a little bit about the theory again. Important thing is that this context of the paper is is why do elites persist? When there's upheaval and there's change, why do they persist? And this paper is trying to distinguish itself from other previous theories, like from Olson about the concentrated power or de facto power that you might see through Axel, Mogul, and Robinson, where that power comes from communication advantages or other advantages. And it pushes the idea that you have these personal connections, these lifestyles you live, this education you live, that makes you more sympathetic to the other people you're dealing with, that they're not as different, and that connections, wherever it comes from, has actual results in serious choices, like who gets purged, who doesn't get purged in trials. But this is a neat theory because this is an old theory, and something that would really strengthen this paper is to directly reference the theory of moral sentiments. This is the whole point of moral sentiments, the idea that you have sympathy, and that once sympathy is developed, there's implications. Now, the most famous example from that book involves a terrible earthquake in China. And they ask you, assuming that you live in the United Kingdom, how much of your body parts are you willing to give up to save a tremendous amount of people from a devastating earthquake in China? And the point here is that you probably aren't, because you don't relate to them. You don't have sympathy to them. Versus on the other extreme, you yourself, if you were to lose a body part, of course, you'd be very troubled by it. Or if you came across someone else you knew personally that lost a body part, you'd be very troubled by it. And that affects what you're willing to do for people or not do for people. And that fits very much into what's being referenced here in the paper. We went to law school. We have a similar perspective of how the world works. We have people that we both know, that we might respect. We have connections. And so it's really, in my perspective, theoretically, a great way to bring in the theory of moral sense. You're putting the impact of that sympathy in terms of potentially elite persistence. But let's talk about some of the assumptions here. So there's an assumption about the change in purge rates. Now, there's a literature out there that was referenced that suggests that increased presence of elites hinders change, and that these people are just seeking favoritism, in which case you can think about an increase in purge rates might be a good thing. But on the other hand, a decrease in rates of purges might actually be a good thing, because we might be doing some sort of information problem. We might have certain elites who hold valuable skills. I mean, it's very telling that in the paper, the elites who really do well are elites who are also seeking future office. That assumption is not necessarily safe. The other challenge when we think about this paper is that while the paper is saying itself as persistence of elites, sort of like a macro way of thinking about it, if you're elected to office in France, you're likely already an elite. I mean, we're really only looking at elites. So maybe a more accurate description is assessing which elites survive the purge. You know, there is still a macro story, but it's a distribution effect, not necessarily like a systematic effect. You know, if certain distributions of elites are the ones judging things, that makes them more likely to be similar to people who might get purged, sure, that will have a macro effect, but that's really more a story about distribution, and it's not really a comparison with true non-elites, at least as presented. You know, it's possible that there's more information about these people who are not lawyers that you could argue they're non-elites, but you're going to have to convince us that those people are really not elites versus just the wrong elites. So let's talk about technological transfer in the early industrial developments, evidence from the Sino-Soviet alliance. The thing that intrigued me the most about this paper is why the results persist across time. I mean, they've done tremendous work to measure knowledge transfer. And it gives us a story in terms of what happens when there's a collapse of relationships and there's no reconciliation. You have persistence over time. But why is that persistent over time? Why isn't that knowledge getting transferred once it's in part of China? Is that something that's kind of a political system? Is that an industrial organization story? I mean, we have to assume that people are incapable of teaching, or we have to assume something is hindering transfer once that knowledge is in China. So what's the case and why? Now, in our references here, there are things like travel restrictions. So could we create a counterfactual story to ask what would be the benefit of releasing those travel restrictions? I mean, we have some idea that people aren't incompetent of teaching, because when this paper looks at their data, they point out that in counties that are doing well, it's not just the one business doing well, but it's the whole surrounding, all the other industries within that county interact with that business. So that already suggests that people are competent at teaching. So maybe it is these travel restrictions. Why are these travel restrictions persisting? Maybe it's political rivalries. I want to be a mercantilist in some respect and keep this benefit locally in my political fiefdom and not let it out. So that's one possibility. But another possibility that doesn't involve any government rivalries, it's just old-fashioned managerial dilemmas. An IO problem. And I strongly recommend Miller's 1992 book, Managerial Dilemmas, which really focuses on the challenges of any business enterprise. And I'm going to use here as an archetypal example, NUMMI. NUMMI was a joint venture by General Motors and Toyota, most famous if their plant in California, where the goal was to transfer knowledge between them two. Toyota wanted to learn how to operate in American business, in the American business environment. GM wanted to learn the Toyota way of manufacturing. And in some ways it fails, like that plant gives them some knowledge. Sorry, it succeeds, but in many ways that plant fails, especially when we look at GM, because the Saturn line, which is what comes out of this experiment, eventually gets killed. And it gets killed because there are political rivalries within GM itself that hinders the dispersion of knowledge. You have organized labor who are very fearful that the model of manufacturing being done at that plant with the Toyota model is going to undermine their labor contracts and affect their ability to distribute benefits to their members. At the same point, you have other management in General Motors who are not part of this experiment, and they see it as a threat to their own personal power within the company. And they end up sort of working together to kill the dispersion of this knowledge, because this knowledge is a political threat to their own well-being. So these are really the big questions to me, because it's neat to see that these plants do well over time. It's neat to see that you have this impact from these resources, but then it's really puzzling to see why that knowledge, that understanding doesn't get really shared with the rest of the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for those comments. And now I think would be for a few moments, give an opportunity for both authors to respond to the comments. Jean or Michaela, do you want to jump in with any sort of thoughts on Aaron's discussion?
So thank you, Aaron, for the comments. Great comments. So maybe to clarify. So I totally agree with you that the connection story could bear some other meanings like empathy and so on. Unfortunately, we cannot really measure that in our data sets. So what we tend to do is to say, okay, we're trying to identify something, and then this something is the materialization of a connection effects, which could be explained by empathy. And I really, thanks for reminding me of Adam Smith and so on. It will be added there for sure. So what we say is somehow, okay, there should be something, and if there's something, we should be able to see it and to capture it somehow in the archives we have. And what we see is that only indirect connections actually could explain or at least correlate with the advantage of law graduates in front of the jury. And then it's quite a different story. It might not be just the jury being empathetic towards defendants. It's like actually third parties getting involved in the process. But obviously for the reasons you told us. Second, so I totally agree with you that it's about which elite persist and not about like elite persist. And we don't, obviously, if you're an MP in France in 1940, you're part of the elite. I would never deny that. So yeah, we might think of the framing, but you could also think that elite is kind of a relative term. So if you're the elite of the elite, you're still an elite in a sense. And yeah, but we'll think of the framing. And thank you for all the comments.
Well, and I want to say, I think both those questions are really interesting questions. I want you to pursue both of them, because the more we can make that distinction, the more we can start thinking about, if you want to influence what's taking place, what those options might be. Like, one reason why I emphasize like Adam Smith's sympathy, because we had that discussion whether or not these elites are solving an information problem or not. If they're just cronyism, then the simple solution, if it's really your connection story, is somehow make them feel less relatable to each other as a purposeful strategy. Or if you think that the problem is that they're being too aggressive, then how do you make them more relatable to each other? And again, is this a transaction cost problem? Like that's always a big question of any of these studies. Are these connections favoritism, or are these connections solving an information problem, a very costly process? I mean, you have a great R-squared, it's 0.28, but it's still only 0.28. That means there's a lot of information we don't necessarily know, and they might not necessarily know either.
Great, Michaela?
So first of all, thank you very much, Aaron, for your comments. And I agree with you that the understanding exactly why the results persisted for so long, it's very important. So I agree with you that the story that maybe the trained workers were not able to teach to other workers may not be the mechanism, because at the local level we observe quite sizable spillovers effect. So I think that is more related to the lack of free movement of labor across the country. For the vast majority of the period that we are considering, the registration system was in place. And while it's true that the government could have forced some specific workers to move to some other plants, there were no free movement of workers, and this may have strongly limited the spillovers effect. And I also think that another reason of persistence is that the plants that receive, in addition to the machinery and the Soviet equipment, also the training, were able to develop their own technology. And of course, you can imagine that part of the technologies that were developed were also sold or diffused to other firms. But they still have a first mover advantage that also create spillovers effect that in turn can have reinforced the initial effect of the program. So I think that in a way, the fact that these were very large plants, and for a very long time, the only large plants in China, make them work in kind of isolated entities in the Chinese setting, and so that's why the results persist so long. Also, thank you very much for pointing out the Miller 1992 citation. This work. This is something that we need to cite in the paper. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it was very neat to see those numbers, and the great thing about those numbers, it really inspires these other questions. I mean, since you have such a good data set, I mean, maybe you will get lucky and you find a region or an area where either those restrictions got broken down or people just didn't follow them, that maybe you could estimate how much it cost the Chinese economy to have those restrictions, because that plays a role not just in discussing China, but anything when we talk about, say, over open borders, or we're talking about borders within France, because they had a lot of internal borders. If you look at something like Nines wine war and taxes, he'll argue that the reason why UK does so much better in France is not because UK had better international trade policy, but they had better domestic trade policies. And in more contemporary debates, because it does still play also in international trade movement of people within NAFTA, within the EU. And so if you could get an estimate on that and that impact, that'd just be very exciting to me.
Thank you, everybody. In our final moments left, I might raise one question for each of you and simply leave this for perhaps food for thought. Jean, what's interesting to me is that the lawyers may or may not have different roles that they played in the Vichy government compared to others. And one wonders if perhaps the lawyers, if their offenses or their positions protected them in some ways. And could it be that the fellow lawyers were able to appreciate that or be cognizant about that in a way that non-lawyers would not? So this may or may not be something that could be answered or discussed, but it raises the question about what exactly were they doing that made them more or less prone to actually be purged out. So just some thought about that. Michaela, one thing that potentially is raised is the notion of capital embodied technological change. And that is, so I think you've documenting that while basic machine transfer doesn't quite maybe have a long persistence, it's that coupled with the sort of secondary or more advanced knowledge. So one wonders, I don't know if the data allows this, but does basic knowledge come first? That is, the machinery needs to be established, and then the expertise, those who would be able to allow the Chinese to understand what it is to use this technology. So the sequence of timing might lay some kind of information about the nature of the technological advance that's happening. Well, with that being said, I want to thank everybody on behalf of myself and the Online Economic History Workshop Conference organizers. I want to thank Jean Lacroix and Michaela Giocelli for sharing your research with us, and Aaron for your thoughts and comments on each presenter's research. I want to also thank the audience for taking the time to join us and for your insights. Your questions help improve research and advance our understanding of the past. Tomorrow at 12 p.m. noon Eastern, you can join us for the Damaged Goods, Reconciliation After Occupation and War panel here on YouTube. To learn more about the papers in tomorrow's panel, or to sign up for email notifications on future online economic history workshops, go to www.oehw.org. Good day.